She had been married for 3 months. Nobody knew. Not her sister, not her mother, not her closest friend. And certainly not the man who was standing across that crowded charity ballroom right now, laughing too loud, arm around his new fiancée, scanning the room with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted that he was the most important person in it. He had not seen her yet, but he would. And when he did, he was going to say something. She knew him well enough to know that. She had known him for 4 years, loved him for 3, and spent the last 11 months learning exactly what kind of man he was when he no longer needed to be kind. His name was Marcus Bren. He was a marketing director. He had a nice smile and sharp elbows and a gift for making people feel small in ways that were difficult to prove. And he had absolutely no idea what was going to happen to him tonight. Callista Hale stood near the edge of the ballroom and did not reach for her glass. She had learned, in the past year, to keep her hands still. It was one of the small disciplines she had built into herself the way you build a wall, one quiet decision at a time, until the structure held without effort. She was 29 years old. She was wearing a simple black dress she had owned for 2 years. She had no jewelry on, no ring on her left hand. And somewhere across Manhattan, in the back seat of a black car moving through rain-slicked streets, a man whose name appeared in federal files and in the nightmares of people who had made the mistake of crossing him was already on his way. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before you can understand that night, you need to understand the year that came before it. Callista had always been the kind of woman people described as capable. Not a compliment, not really, though it sounded like one. Capable meant she handled things. Capable meant she did not make a fuss. Capable meant she showed up and did the work, and never asked anyone to notice how hard she was working to make it look easy. She had built something real over 4 years in New York. A senior position at a branding firm in Midtown. A 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the island, small but hers, with a window that caught the afternoon light in a way she had decided made it worth the rent. An engagement ring from a man she had believed when he said she was the one person in his life who truly understood him. She had worked for all of it. She had not inherited any of it. She had not been given any of it. She had simply shown up year after year and refused to let the city grind her down. And for a while, she had believed that was enough. Then, in the space of 11 months, she lost everything. The engagement ended on a Thursday evening in April, in her apartment, in the living room where she had made them coffee that morning before work like she did every morning. Marcus sat across from her on the sofa she had chosen, and told her, in the careful, practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed this conversation, that he had developed feelings for someone else. He said it the way people announce bad weather, as a fact. Unfortunate but not worth excessive emotion. The someone else was Tiffany Reese, who worked 3 desks from Callista at the firm, and who had been to their apartment for dinner exactly 6 times, and who Callista had described, once to her sister, as one of those people who makes every room a little brighter just by being in it. Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable for approximately 45 seconds. Then he asked whether she wanted him to leave that night or wait until the weekend to move his things. She told him to leave that night. She did not cry. Not when he told her. Not when she watched him carry 2 bags down to the lobby. Not when she stood at the window and watched the cab pull away into the dark. She stood in her own apartment, in the apartment she had furnished piece by piece with money she had earned herself. And she stayed very still for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made herself dinner, because it was 7 in the evening and she had not eaten since lunch. And because the only thing she could think of that was entirely within her control in that moment was whether or not she ate a meal. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, She was going through the hall closet. She had not planned to. She was looking for a coat. And there, behind the coats, on the floor behind a box of winter boots, was a folder. Dark blue. Her handwriting on the tab. It said simply, "Wedding." She had forgotten it was there. She had put it there 8 months earlier when they had started the planning in earnest, and she had meant to move it to her desk. And then there had always been something else to do, and she had left it where it was. She sat down on the floor of the closet. She opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, venue brochures with her notes in the margins, a guest list with 64 names on it, a seating chart with the two of them at the center table, her name and Marcus's name written side by side in a font she had chosen herself because she had liked the way the two names looked together. She had liked the way the two names looked together. She sat on the floor of her closet holding this seating chart, and she did not move for a long time. She was not crying. She was simply holding it. She stayed there until her legs went numb and the afternoon light shifted and the apartment got quiet in the way apartments get quiet in the early evening when no one else is coming home. Then she put everything back in the folder. She closed it. She put it in a bag. She put the bag by the front door for the morning trash. She stood up, brushed off her knees, and went to make herself a cup of tea. That was all. That was the whole thing. That was the moment that she would remember later. Not as the worst moment, but as the clearest one. The moment she understood precisely what she had lost and decided, without drama, to keep going anyway. She cried 3 days later. In a Starbucks on 58th Street, into a sleeve of paper napkins, for exactly 11 minutes. Then she wiped her face and ordered another coffee and made a list of what she needed to do next. But here is what nobody told her about starting over at 29. It is not dramatic. It does not look like a movie. It looks like Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then another Wednesday, and another one after that. Each one nearly identical to the last, each one requiring the same small acts of maintenance and survival. Paying bills in the wrong order so the most important ones get paid first. Eating the same meals on rotation because they are cheap and she has already run the math on everything else. Smiling in client calls while a collection notice sits open in another tab on her screen just outside the camera frame. It is survival dressed up as competence. And Callista Hale was very, very good at it. The job went 2 months after Marcus left. Her manager, a man named Gerald Holt, who had always found reasons to keep her late, who had always stood a little too close during feedback sessions, called her into his office on a Monday afternoon and closed the door behind her. He told her that her performance had been inconsistent lately and that the firm was making adjustments. What he meant was that she had declined his dinner invitation twice, and his suggestion that they discuss her contract renewal at his apartment once, and that this pattern had become inconvenient for him. She understood perfectly what was happening. She took her things from her desk that afternoon in a box she borrowed from the mailroom. She said goodbye to no one. She walked out onto Fifth Avenue, into a wind so cold it made her eyes water. Which was not crying, she reminded herself. It was simply the weather. And then, 3 months after that, on the 4th floor of a parking garage in Queens on a Tuesday morning, she sat in her car with a final notice from her landlord and a bank balance that did not come close to covering what she owed. And she looked at the steering wheel for a very long time. She did not call her sister. She did not call her mother. She had spent 11 months protecting the people she loved from knowing how bad it had gotten, and she was not going to stop now. She drove to a coffee shop and opened her laptop and started making calls. What she did not know, sitting in that parking garage, was that Gerald Holt had not simply fired her and moved on. 3 weeks after she left the firm, he had submitted a formal complaint to a city licensing office naming a former employee, unspecified by name but identifiable by the dates and the description, in an allegation of document theft. The complaint was designed as a preemptive strike. If Callista ever decided to speak about what she knew regarding Holt's conduct, this complaint would be waiting. A woman with a theft allegation on file is a woman whose story becomes harder to tell, harder to believe. What she also did not know was that someone else had found the complaint first. Before she ever arrived in Montauk, before she ever walked into that diner in the rain, before any of this, someone had already been watching. Now we go to Montauk. 6 weeks after the parking garage, in October, on a Tuesday evening when the summer season had ended and most of the restaurants were closed and the beach was as empty as a thought you cannot finish. Callista drove out there on impulse after a client meeting collapsed at the last minute. She had nowhere she needed to be and a full tank of gas and the kind of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from holding yourself together for too long without rest. She drove east. She stopped when she saw the ocean. She found the diner because it had lights and because the parking lot was almost empty and because the sign in the window said open. She ordered coffee, a piece of pie she did not eat. She sat at the corner table by the window and watched the rain come in across the water, and she let herself be quiet for the first time in months. And then the door opened. The man who walked in did not look like someone who needed help. He looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that needing help was not an option available to him. Tall, moving with the kind of control that is not grace exactly, but something harder and more deliberate than grace. He was wearing a dark wool jacket, the kind that belongs in a boardroom, not a Montauk diner at 9 in the evening. And he made it to the counter before Callista noticed that his left hand was pressed against his side, and that the jacket, dark as it was darker still along the left seam. The woman behind the counter looked up at him, then looked away very quickly. That look told Callista everything she needed to know about what kind of man this was. She did not think. She picked up her bag, walked to the counter, and said to him, "Sit down. Let me look at it." He turned. His eyes were gray, or perhaps they only looked gray in that light. What she remembered afterward was not the color, but the quality. The way he looked at her like he was making a very fast, very careful decision. He said, "I do not need." She said, "You are bleeding through your jacket onto a diner floor in Montauk at 9 in the evening. You clearly need something. Sit down." He sat down. She used her scarf, cashmere, a Christmas gift she had kept because it was warm, even though it reminded her of the person who gave it, to apply pressure. She did not ask what happened. She did not ask his name. She did not take out her phone. He watched her work with the focused, unblinking attention of a man completely unaccustomed to receiving care from someone not paid to provide it. "You are not going to ask?" he said. "Ask what?" she said. "What happened?" he said. She looked up at him. "Would you tell me the truth if I did?" she asked. A pause. "No," he said. "Then there is nothing to ask," she said, and went back to what she was doing. He left 40 minutes later. He did not tell her his name. He left a careful amount of money on the counter for the owner, not for her. She understood that from the way he placed it. And at the door, he turned back once. "You should have run," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I do not run from people bleeding on the ground." Something moved across his face. Not gratitude. Something older than gratitude. Something that had not been given a name yet. And then he was gone. She sat at the table after he left for a very long time. She did not look at her phone. She looked at the window where the rain was still coming in off the water, and she turned over what had just happened, the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. She had patched up a stranger in a diner at 9 in the evening, and she had asked nothing and received nothing. And now he was gone, and she would never see him again. That was fine. That was the natural end of the thing. She was not disappointed. She was not hoping for anything. She had simply done what the situation called for, which was what she always did. And now she was going to finish her coffee and drive back to Queens, go to sleep and get up tomorrow and do whatever tomorrow required. She signaled to the woman behind the counter for the check. The woman came over and said that was already taken care of, and nodded toward the door where the man had left. Callista looked at the counter where the money was. More money than dinner for two would cost in a restaurant far more expensive than this diner. And she understood without anyone explaining it that this was the only thing he had been able to offer, and that he had offered it in the only way available to him, without asking whether it was wanted, without requiring acknowledgement. She left her own money beside it anyway, an exact and appropriate amount, because she paid for what she used and she did not owe anything to anyone. And she drove home in the rain, thinking about a man whose name she did not know and the quality of his attention when he had been watching her work, as though she were doing something extraordinary when she was simply doing the obvious thing that needed to be done. He found her 3 days later. She was finishing a video call with a client when the buzzer rang. She went to the door. 2 men in dark coats stood in the hallway. Behind them, at the end of the corridor, the man from the diner. Clean jacket this time. No evidence of what had happened 3 days ago. The same gray eyes. His name, she learned that evening, was Declan Morrow. She had heard the name once before, in passing. A colleague at her former firm had mentioned it in relation to a real estate development project so large that the firm had not even bothered to pitch for the contract. She had not thought about it since. What she did not know was that Declan Morrow's name appeared in a great many other places. Federal case files, certain closed-door meetings in certain offices. The private conversations of men who had learned that saying his name too loudly had consequences. He sat across from her in her small kitchen, his presence making it feel smaller, and he was direct. Her former employer had connections she was not aware of. There had been an incident that was not quite a threat, not provable as one, but clear enough to people who knew how to read such things. His organization had been monitoring Holt for unrelated reasons. She had become adjacent to something larger than she knew. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you are in a situation that is going to get worse before it gets better on its own. And I am in a situation that requires a particular kind of solution." Then he told her what he was proposing. A marriage. Legal, documented, private. A ceremony with 2 witnesses. No ring worn publicly, no announcement, full discretion. In exchange, she received protection. Her debts cleared. Her former employer managed legally until he was no longer a variable. In exchange, he received a wife, a legitimate public identity for a man whose world ran more smoothly when it had the appearance of normalcy. She was quiet for a moment. She looked around her kitchen. The sublet she could barely afford. The sketchbook on the counter with 3 unfinished projects inside. She looked at this man, this controlled and careful and clearly dangerous man, and she asked one question. She asked not about the money or the safety or the arrangement. She asked, "Will you lie to me?" He looked at her. "About anything that affects your life directly? No," he said. "Not omissions, not misdirection. If something changes that touches your safety or your choices, you hear it from me first." She extended her hand across the table. He took it. His grip was warm and brief and absolutely steady. "All right then," she said. "Where do I sign?" She said yes for reasons that had nothing to do with money and nothing to do with romance. She said yes because for the first time in 11 months, someone had looked at her situation and not asked her to make herself smaller in order to survive it. He had not offered charity. He had not offered pity. He had offered a transaction between two people who each had something the other needed. And there was something almost respectful about that. The cleanliness of it. The absence of pretense. The ceremony was brief. A hotel suite. 2 witnesses. His lawyer, a thin man who asked no questions, and a woman named Vesper Chase, who was Declan's head of security and who looked at Callista with the expression of someone doing very rapid, very private calculations. Callista wore a black dress she already owned. Declan wore a suit. The judge was efficient and professional and asked nothing. When it was over, the lawyer left. Then the judge. Vesper paused at the door. She looked at Callista for a moment and said, "You know, he refused twice before this." Callista looked at her. Vesper said, "His lawyers put 2 other names forward. Women who fit the profile. He said no both times." She waited a beat. "He said yes to you the same day your file crossed his desk." She let that land. Then she said, "I am not telling you what to do with that information." And then she was gone too. Callista stood in the hotel suite with a legal document in her bag and the memory of a handshake still warm in her palm, and thought about what Vesper had just said. He said yes to you the same day your file crossed his desk. She turned that over in her mind all the way back to Queens. And then she put it away, the way she put most things away, into the quiet space inside herself, where she kept the things that were too complicated to look at directly. Not forever, just for now. The arrangement in practice was quieter than she had expected. She saw Declan perhaps twice a week. He had given her a key to the penthouse, a security code, and clear information about the 11 rooms she did not need to enter. He was not cold. He was contained. He occupied space without using more of it than necessary, and he had the rare quality of being genuinely still when he was still. Not tense, not waiting to perform, simply present and quiet in the way that very few people are capable of being. She found it easier to work in his presence than in her own apartment. She had not expected that. He noticed things. She understood this gradually. The coffee that appeared outside her workspace door each morning left without comment, prepared exactly the way she took it, even though she had never mentioned to anyone how she took her coffee. The second time she noticed a man following her home from a client meeting in Midtown, and the following morning that man was simply gone, with no explanation and no drama. When she mentioned in passing that her project management software subscription had lapsed and she was working around it, a new annual license appeared in her email within the hour from an address she did not recognize. No note, no acknowledgement. She thanked him once, directly. He looked briefly, genuinely uncomfortable, and changed the subject. She kept a sketchbook. It was the one habit she had maintained through everything, the way a sailor keeps a compass even when there is no coast in sight. She drew in it every evening. Client work sometimes, architecture, faces she noticed in coffee shops. She had kept a sketchbook since she was 17 years old, and she had never shown it to anyone. 3 weeks after the ceremony, sitting at the kitchen table in the penthouse with a deadline she was nearly finished meeting, she looked up from her screen and found her hand moving across the sketchbook page before she had consciously decided to draw anything. She looked down. It was Declan, the line of his jaw, the particular angle of his attention when he was listening. The ring on his right hand that she had noticed he wore always, never removed, never mentioned. She had almost asked about it once and had stopped herself. And later that week she mentioned to Vesper, offhand, that she had been curious. Vesper had looked at her with an expression she could not fully read and said, "Do not ask him about that ring unless you are ready for the answer." And that was all she said. Callista spent 40 minutes on the portrait without realizing how long she had been working. She closed the sketchbook when she heard him come in. The next morning, the book was on the counter where she had left it, closed, replaced with precise care. He had seen it. She was certain of it. And he had said nothing. She stood in the kitchen holding her coffee and felt something shift inside her. Something she did not immediately have a name for. Something she filed carefully away, next to the information about him saying yes to her the same day her file crossed his desk. Now, here is the part where Marcus Bren reappears. He turned up 6 weeks after the ceremony. Not in her life exactly. He turned up in the orbit of it, the way he had a gift for appearing in spaces adjacent to her, as though some part of him required the confirmation that she was still diminished, still manageable, still the version of herself that existed in relation to him. She saw him outside the Plaza Hotel on a Wednesday afternoon. She was early for a meeting with a potential new client, a woman named Sandra Cho, who was the vice president of brand strategy at a healthcare company. And the contract, if it came through, was the largest she had ever pitched for on her own. She was standing outside, going over her notes when she looked up. And there he was. Marcus with Tiffany. Tiffany wearing the ring Callista had seen, announced on her phone 6 months earlier in the photo that had taken 3 days to stop looking at. They were coming out of the hotel, laughing, and Marcus saw her before she could decide what to do with her face. He stopped. He said her name with the particular warmth of a man who has decided that warmth costs nothing and signals generosity. Then he said, "Callie, you look tired. How is the freelance thing going?" He said it with the smile of a man asking about a child's drawing. And then, because Marcus had always had an exceptional instinct for finding the most useful wound and pressing his thumb into it at precisely the right moment, he glanced at Sandra Cho, who had just come through the lobby door and was approaching Callista with her hand extended. He stepped forward before Callista could speak. He introduced himself. He said he was an old friend of Callista's, practically family. And then he said, "I actually know your firm, Sandra. I know David Morrison personally." He lowered his voice just enough that it created the impression of discretion without actually providing any. He said, "Full disclosure, Callista and I go way back, so I want to be fair to you. She had some performance issues at her last position. That is what led to the transition to freelance." He smiled again. "Not saying it reflects her work now, obviously. Just thought you should have the full picture." The ballroom fell away. Callista heard the words, as though through water. She watched Sandra Cho's expression move through its changes, the slight withdrawal, the recalibration, the careful professional neutrality that covered what had just happened. She watched Marcus still smiling, satisfied, the smile of a man who has made himself feel large by making someone else feel small, and has mistaken the sensation for something that actually matters. She stood very still. She did not reach for her bag. She did not look away from Marcus. She felt something cold and absolute settle in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but the thing that comes just before anger. The recognition that what has just happened cannot be undone and does not deserve to go unanswered. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Declan Morrow. A call. She picked up. His voice came through low and even. The same voice he used for everything, board meetings and private conversations. And she had once heard through an office door, a phone call with someone who had made the mistake of threatening him directly. He said, "I am in the lobby. Tell me if you need a reason to end the conversation you are currently having." She looked at Marcus, who was watching her with the satisfied expression of a man who believes he already knows what the situation is. She said 3 words into the phone. "Second floor. Atrium." She ended the call. She looked at Marcus for one more moment. Not long, just long enough to let him understand that she was choosing to walk away rather than unable to speak. Then she turned to Sandra Cho and said, "I apologize. I will see you upstairs." She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood inside the small metal box and breathed. The atrium on the second floor was a wide, light-filled space. Marble floors, a ceiling that disappeared into glass and steel, the kind of room designed to make a certain kind of person feel the exact weight of their position in the world. Sandra Cho was at a table near the window. Callista crossed to her, set down her bag, and was about to begin the apology when she felt the change in the room. It happened before she saw him. A shift in how the space felt, in how the people at nearby tables adjusted their posture without knowing why they were doing it. Declan walked into the atrium, and the room did what rooms did around him. Not because he performed anything, not because he demanded anything, but because men like Declan Morrow have a quality that is difficult to name and impossible to fake, a kind of gravity, the sense that the space around them has been reorganized without anyone being informed. He crossed toward her. He did not hurry. He placed his hand at the small of her back, brief and deliberate and unmistakable. Sandra Cho looked up. Her expression changed. It was not fear exactly, though there was something adjacent to it in the widening of her eyes. It was recognition, the kind that comes from knowing a name and suddenly seeing the face attached to it. Declan did not look at Marcus, who had followed them upstairs and was standing 6 feet away, processing what he was seeing. Declan looked at Sandra Cho. He said, "My wife was kind enough to take this meeting while I was finishing a call upstairs. She is exceptionally talented. Whatever number you had in mind for this contract, I would recommend doubling it." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Wife. Sandra Cho blinked. She looked at Callista. She looked at Declan. She looked back at Callista. Marcus made a sound. He said, "She is not. You are not. This is." He stopped. He started again. "You two are not, actually." He was losing the thread, and he knew it. Callista reached into her bag. She removed a small jewelry box. She opened it. Inside, a ring she had been carrying for 3 months without wearing, a ring that Declan had provided on the day of the ceremony, and that she had put in her bag on that same day, and had kept there, private, the way she kept everything that mattered. She took the ring out of the box. She looked at Marcus. She placed the ring on her own finger. Slowly, without any drama, just a deliberate, considered act. She did it herself. Not because Declan asked, not because the situation required performance, because she was choosing it, right now, in this room, in front of this man who had just told a potential client she had performance issues at her last position. 3 months, she said. We have been married 3 months. Marcus went pale. Not pink, not flushed, pale. The particular pale of a man watching a story he thought he controlled rewrite itself around him in real time. Tiffany, who had followed him upstairs, stood in the doorway of the atrium. She looked at the ring on Callista's finger. She looked at Marcus's face, and Callista saw it, in Tiffany's expression, in the exact quality of the look. She saw the thing she had worn on her own face on the evening in her apartment when Marcus had told her about his feelings for someone else. The look of a woman who is beginning to understand that she was never the whole story either. Declan turned to Marcus then. Only once. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You have spent a significant amount of my wife's morning being unpleasant. I will give you one opportunity to use the door before I use several minutes being unpleasant in return." Marcus left. Quickly. Without another word. Sandra Cho waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded. Then she looked at Callista with an expression that had moved well past professional neutrality into something warmer and more considered. She extended her hand. She said, I look forward to working together." She glanced at Declan briefly and said, "She negotiates her own contracts, I assume." Declan looked at Callista. He said, "Always." That evening, Callista found him on the terrace of the penthouse. Manhattan spread out below them, amber and white and inexhaustible. A city that kept going regardless of what any single person inside it was feeling. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a long time. She said, "You did not have to come." He said, "I know." She said, "You could have sent someone." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you come yourself?" He looked at the city for a moment. Then he said, "Because I wanted to." She absorbed that. Then she said, "I thought this was a contract." He said, "It was," she said. "And now?" He did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way he was careful about things that mattered. He said, "Now it is something I have not found the right word for yet." She said, "Vesper told me you said no twice." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you say yes to me?" A long pause. He said, "Because you pulled a stranger into a diner in a storm and did not ask a single question. Because when I said you should have run, you told me you do not run from people bleeding on the ground. And because your file contained 40 pages of evidence that you had been very deliberately damaged by people who were afraid of what you could do if you were given the chance to do it." He paused. "I have spent 6 years taking apart the kind of people who do that to someone. I was not going to participate in it." She was quiet. She looked at the ring on her hand, the ring she had put there herself this afternoon. Then she said, "What happened to your sister?" He did not answer immediately. She had not known she was going to ask it until she did. For a moment, she thought she had gone too far, crossed the line that she had been careful not to cross since the beginning of all of this. The line between the arrangement and something more complicated than the arrangement. But he told her. He told her about Rowan, how old she was, what she was studying, what she had wanted to do with her life. He told her about the network, the connections between legitimate companies and criminal enterprises, the way money moved through certain channels and what it was used for once it moved. He told her about the phone call 6 years ago that he had answered too late. He told it in pieces, carefully, the way you tell something you have never told anyone before, testing each word to see if it survives being said out loud. She listened without moving. She did not reach for him. She did not offer words. She was simply present, which was, she understood now, the thing he had needed from the beginning without being able to ask for it. When he finished, she went inside. She came back with her sketchbook. She held it out to him, open to the page. He looked down at his own face, rendered in her careful, precise lines, the angle of the jaw, the particular quality of the attention, present and contained at once. The ring on the right hand. She had drawn the ring with the same care she'd given everything else, not avoiding it, not explaining it, simply including it because it was part of the picture. He looked at the portrait for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, as though the words surprised him, "You see me." She held his gaze. "I have always seen you," she said, "even when you were bleeding in a diner booth." He exhaled, not dramatically, just a breath released, the kind of breath you do not know you have been holding until you let it go. He looked at the drawing once more, and then at her, and she thought she understood something then that she had been turning over for weeks without being able to name it. He was not afraid of her. Most people, she had noticed over the years, were at least a little afraid of the quality of her attention, the way she saw things, the way she remembered details they had not meant to reveal. Marcus had been afraid of it. Her former manager had been afraid of it. Even her sister sometimes looked at her with the expression of someone who suspects they are being read more clearly than they would like. Declan was not afraid of it. He had recognized it from the beginning. That was why he had watched her so carefully in that diner. He had been reading her the way she read everyone else, and he had not been threatened. He had been interested. It was, she understood now, the closest thing to being truly met that she had experienced in a very long time. She reached over and closed the sketchbook herself, gently, replacing it on the railing beside them. Then she left her hand there, close to his, not touching. He turned his hand over and rested it against hers, not holding, just present. The city kept going below them, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that the quiet was not already saying. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled attention, not the careful stillness, but something underneath all of that. Something that had been there for a long time, without a way out. He reached over and closed the sketchbook, gently, the way you close something valuable. Then he left his hand beside hers on the railing, not touching, just close. Both of them looking out at the city, both of them choosing, quietly and without ceremony, to stay. 6 weeks later, the federal case was completed. The network Gerald Holt had been connected to, the same network that had taken Rowan Morrow from her brother at 23 years old, was dismantled in a process so precise and thorough that the people who covered such things said afterward that it looked less like a prosecution than a systematic demolition, every wall taken down in a specific order so that the whole thing fell cleanly. Gerald Holt was arrested on multiple charges. The complaint he had filed against Callista was withdrawn as part of a process that left no trace of it in any record she might encounter later. 3 design firms called her in the same week. The contract with Sandra Cho went through at twice the original number. Vesper sent her a bottle of champagne with a card that said simply, "Told you so." One afternoon in November, Callista drove out to Montauk. She did not tell Declan. She drove east because she needed to think, and because she had learned by now that thinking happened better for her when she was moving toward the water. She found the diner. She parked in the nearly empty lot. She went inside and sat at the corner table by the window and ordered coffee and looked at the ocean. 40 minutes later, the door opened. She did not look up immediately. She already knew the way the room changed when he walked into it. He sat down across from her. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were both quiet for a moment. The way they had gotten comfortable being quiet together, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. She said, "This is where it started." He said, "This is where you chose not to run." She smiled. She reached into her bag and took out her sketchbook and slid it across the table. He looked down. She had drawn the diner, the view from this exact window, the rain on the glass, 2 coffee cups on a table, and 2 hands reaching from opposite sides toward the center of the page. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at her. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the drawing, her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his in return, and they sat there in the diner in November, with the ocean outside and the coffee going cold, and nothing they needed to perform for anyone. She was wearing the ring. She had been wearing it for 6 weeks now, openly, and not for Marcus or for anyone who had ever assumed that she was smaller than she was. She wore it because it meant something, because she was done being quiet about things that meant something. "I love you," she said, just like that. No ceremony, no build-up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure it never costs you anything to say that." She smiled at him. The real smile, the one that had nothing to do with composure or strategy or survival. He smiled back. the rare and private one she had seen exactly 3 times before, and had drawn from memory once on a page she had not shown him yet. They sat there until the coffee was cold and the rain picked up again against the glass and the ocean did what oceans do, which is keep going, quietly and completely, regardless of whether anyone is watching. And now, before we leave this story, I want to say something. Because this story is not really about a mafia boss or a charity gala or a ring placed on a finger in a marble atrium in Manhattan. Those are the shapes the story takes. But what the story is actually about is something you already know. It is about a woman who lost everything in 11 months and rebuilt it in silence. Without asking anyone for help, without letting anyone see how hard the rebuilding was, without once compromising the part of herself that knew what she deserved, even when the evidence around her was suggesting otherwise. It is about the particular endurance of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped expecting to be seen and simply focused on being, on showing up and doing the work and carrying herself with a dignity that does not require an audience. There is a story we tell women from the time they are very young about what rescue looks like. We tell them to wait. We tell them the right ending involves someone arriving, someone finally seeing them. And sometimes that part is true. But the part the story leaves out is this. The woman in that narrative was never invisible. She was there all along. She was seen all along by the people who chose to look past her, by the circumstances designed to diminish her, by the voice inside herself that she kept trusting even when there was very little left to trust it with. Callista did not get rescued. She got clear about what she would accept, about what she had already survived, about the difference between waiting to be chosen and choosing herself first, and then, when the time came, choosing someone who had earned the standing. Declan did not save her. He stayed long enough to see what she was already capable of. She stayed long enough to see what he was carrying. And they chose each other with full information, slowly, without drama, the way the best choices are always made. If you have ever rebuilt something alone without anyone clapping for you, if you have ever smiled in a room that expected you to break, if you have ever been the most capable person in a situation designed to make you feel small, this story is yours. You were never nothing. You were simply in the wrong room, waiting for the world to catch up to what you already knew about yourself. Survival was always yours. Love was just what came after. If this story reached something real in you, if any part of Callista felt familiar, if something in the way she carried herself through an impossible year reminded you of your own quiet endurance, please hit the like button before you go. That one small action tells YouTube that this story is worth sharing with someone who needs it. And please leave a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Tell me if you have ever placed your own ring on your own finger and felt exactly what that costs and exactly what it means. Tell me if you have ever survived something that no one else knew about. Your comments keep these stories alive, and they help this channel reach the women who need them most. If you are new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we bring stories like this one, long and cinematic and built for the kind of listening that stays with you after the screen goes dark. Share this with someone who needed to hear it today. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next story.